Marcus had always thought of himself as a man of little surprise, someone whose life had been meticulously measured between work, bills, and the chaotic joy of raising his only daughter, Jasmine. Yet nothing in his orderly existence had prepared him for the day he decided, almost on a whim, to bring his lunch to her school, to peek for just a few minutes into the world she navigated every day without him. The morning had been a blur of coffee, quick hugs, and the usual bustle of trying to get Jasmine out of the door without forgetting half her homework or spilling juice on her uniform. Marcus drove the familiar route to the elementary school, the hum of the tires on asphalt blending with the rhythm of his thoughts. Would she even want him there? Would she notice him? Or would she be embarrassed by the presence of a father who sometimes felt more like a visitor than a partner in her life? Parking in the lot, he could already see the typical chaos. Parents buzzing in circles, kids chasing each other, teachers waving and calling names. He grabbed his lunch bag, a simple brown paper sack, and made his way to the entrance. As he stepped through the doors, the air changed. The smells of cafeteria food, stale pizza, mashed potatoes, industrial-grade chicken nuggets, mingled with a faint, almost intoxicating scent of crayons, books, and the faint perfume of new beginnings. Jasmine's classroom was just around the corner, and he could hear the low hum of chatter and laughter. Hesitating for only a second, he peeked in and froze. She wasn't alone. Not in the ordinary, expected sense of not alone, but in a way that made his stomach drop and his pulse spike. Jasmine sat at a table with a small group of kids, yes, but standing at the head of the table, commanding attention with an intensity Marcus had never seen before, was a teacher, or at least someone who looked like one, whose presence seemed to bend the very air of the cafeteria. He squinted, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks, because the woman had an aura, a magnetism, that drew every child's gaze. Her gestures were deliberate, her tone both gentle and hypnotic, and as Marcus watched in the doorway, a chill ran down his spine. Something was off. The kids were not merely listening. They were hanging on every word, leaning forward in a way that suggested awe, fear, or perhaps both. Jasmine caught sight of him, waved hesitantly, and smiled, but Marcus barely registered her gesture. His attention was glued to the teacher's movements. Then came the first sign that this was no ordinary lunchtime instruction. A small boy, no more than 7, stood up and quietly repeated a phrase the teacher had just spoken. It was rhythmic, almost chant-like, and as he spoke, other children echoed him in a low, synchronized murmur. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had expected noise, chatter, maybe a few spills or minor chaos, but this was different. The room had transformed into a stage for something unsettlingly precise. He stepped closer, careful not to make a scene, gripping his lunch bag like a shield. The words the children were repeating were strange, almost foreign to him. They weren't just practicing a song or a spelling exercise. There was a cadence to them that sounded almost ceremonial. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, thinking perhaps he had misheard, when suddenly Jasmine herself spoke, her voice clear and confident, enunciating the strange words as if she had known them all her life. Marcus's mind raced. Had she been practicing something at home? Something secret? He felt the familiar warmth of parental pride battle with an icy wave of anxiety. Before he could gather his courage to enter, the teacher turned suddenly, eyes locking on his in a way that felt like a spotlight. A shiver ran down his spine, the cafeteria seeming to shrink around him. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was knowing, almost conspiratorial, as if she had anticipated his arrival. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. Was this normal? Was this safe? A part of him screamed to grab Jasmine and run, to shield her from whatever was unfolding. And yet, another part, the part that had always trusted her instincts, whispered that she was fine, that she had always been sharper than him, smarter, more capable. He took a hesitant step forward, only to feel the floor seem to tilt, the voices of the children, rising into a strange harmony that reverberated in his chest. He clutched the bag tighter. His fatherly instincts collided with confusion, disbelief, and a creeping sense of dread. And then, just as he was about to speak, the teacher raised her hand, and with a single, fluid motion, the room fell utterly silent. Every child froze mid-action, eyes wide, all attention directed toward her. Marcus swallowed hard. The silence was deafening. He realized he could hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady, but somehow menacing. The teacher's gaze swept across the room, paused on Marcus, and she spoke a single word, soft, deliberate, almost melodic. Observe. That word hung in the air like a spell. Marcus's knees weakened, his grip on the lunch bag slipping as he felt the weight of something immense pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, reminding himself it was just a school, just a lunchtime, just something he didn't understand yet. But as he opened his mouth to speak, something impossible happened. The room seemed to shift, not physically, but perceptually, as if the walls themselves had dissolved, leaving only the table, the children, Jasmine, and the teacher. And in that moment, Marcus realized that whatever he had stumbled into was far beyond a simple school lunch. There was a rhythm, a pattern, an intelligence in the air, and he was no longer sure if he had come to witness a moment of learning, or a revelation he wasn't prepared for. Jasmine's eyes met his again, this time not with a shy wave of a daughter greeting her father, but with a steady, knowing look that sent a shiver down his spine. She was part of this, he realized, part of whatever was happening here, and the weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. Just as he tried to move closer, the teacher spoke again, her voice calm, deliberate, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards into his feet. "Do you see?" she asked, but it wasn't a question. It was a command. Marcus froze, unsure if he should respond, move, or run. The cafeteria, the laughter, the smell of lunch, all of it had become secondary to the mesmerizing, terrifying energy emanating from the head of the table. And then, without warning, a child at the far end of the table gasped, clutched his chest, and fell backward into the seat beside him, eyes wide with shock. Marcus's pulse skyrocketed. He could feel the panic building. But the teacher remained calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. The children, too, remained motionless, their gazes locked forward, mouths slightly open in silent repetition. Jasmine reached over, touched the boy's shoulder lightly, and whispered something, and the boy's face softened. He blinked, shook his head, and sat upright as though nothing had occurred. Marcus's mind reeled. What was going on? Was this some elaborate prank? A psychological experiment? Or something beyond comprehension? Something that no father should ever witness in a school cafeteria? And before he could gather his thoughts, the teacher's eyes met his once more, and with a barely perceptible nod, she gestured for him to step inside. The invitation, though silent, was undeniable. Marcus took a tentative step forward, his lunch bag dangling uselessly at his side. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to grab Jasmine and leave immediately, but something deeper, something curious and unreasoning, compelled him to move further into the unknown. And as he crossed the threshold into the table's circle, the air seemed to thrum with energy, a vibration so subtle and pervasive that it touched his very bones. The children's chant had stopped, replaced by a low, almost inaudible hum, and Marcus realized with jolt that they were all staring not at the teacher now, but at him, every single one. And in that moment he understood two things. The first, that he was in a place far stranger and more powerful than any school he had ever known. And the second, that the ordinary rules of lunchtime, of fathers and daughters, of teachers and students, no longer applied. Jasmine reached out, her small hand brushing against his, and the touch was electric, sending a current up his arm that made him gasp. He looked into her eyes and found not fear, but an understanding that chilled and thrilled him at once. Then the teacher spoke again, softly, almost to herself. "It begins." At that instant, the cafeteria doors slammed shut with a resounding echo, and Marcus realized with a jolt that no one else was leaving and no one could enter. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thickened, and a low, resonant hum began to rise from the floor. Marcus's mind screamed for answers, but no sound escaped his lips. Jasmine squeezed his hand once more, and for the first time in his life, Marcus understood that the world he had known, the safe, predictable life of dad duties, was over. Whatever lay ahead, it had already begun, and he was right in the middle of it, powerless, fascinated, and utterly unprepared. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of panic, disbelief, and a father's instinctual need to protect. But the moment he tried to pull Jasmine toward the cafeteria exit, he realized it was futile. The doors were movable, locked as if welded by some unseen force, and the hum in the air vibrated through the soles of his shoes, resonating in his chest like a drumbeat that matched his racing heartbeat. The children remained perfectly still, their wide eyes now glinting with something unnatural, a kind of awareness that made Marcus question every assumption he had about innocence, about school, about the simple, predictable life he thought he knew. Jasmine tugged lightly at his hand, urging him to move forward rather than back, and Marcus had no choice but to follow, stepping cautiously around the circular table that had become the epicenter of this eerie, almost ritualistic scene. The teacher, whose presence seemed to bend reality itself, moved slowly among the students, her fingers brushing lightly over their heads, and each child responded with a subtle shiver, a visible ripple of energy that made the hair on Marcus's arms stand on end. He wanted to shout to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat, replaced by a growing sense of awe, fear, and something he couldn't quite name. Reverence, perhaps, for sheer control she wielded over the room, over the children, over the space itself. "Observe, Marcus," she said again, her voice now resonating in a way that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull, carrying a weight and authority that made him stumble slightly forward. He noticed Jasmine watching him, her face calm, almost serene, and in that moment he realized she was not merely a participant but an active part of whatever was unfolding, that she had been prepared for this in ways he had never imagined. He forced himself to focus, to scan the room for logic, for a rational explanation. Could be a meditation program, some advanced learning exercise, a performance art experiment? No, it was far too precise, too powerful, too alive. Suddenly, the teacher raised her arms, and the hum escalated into a low, pulsing vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Marcus felt his knees weaken. The air shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt, though there was no warmth. The children responded instantly, their bodies moving in subtle, synchronized motions that Marcus couldn't immediately interpret, and he realized with a jolt that they were following instructions he couldn't see, commands he couldn't comprehend, performing actions that blurred the line between learning and something else entirely. His gaze fell on Jasmine, whose expression was focused, intense, and for a split second Marcus thought he saw her lips move, whispering in the same strange, rhythmic cadence the other children had been repeating earlier. Panic and pride warred inside him. His little girl was part of this extraordinary phenomenon, and he was utterly powerless to protect her, to intervene, or even to understand. The teacher's eyes shifted toward him again, holding his gaze, and a shiver ran down his spine as if she could peer directly into his thoughts. "Do you see, Marcus?" she asked softly, the words carrying a gravity that made him feel exposed, like a man standing naked in a storm. He nodded, though he wasn't certain he actually understood anything beyond the surreal reality he was trapped in. Before he could speak, the cafeteria lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls, stretching and twisting the room into shapes that seemed almost alive. The children's chanting, or whatever the rhythmic murmur had become, rose and fell in a wave, and Marcus felt a pull in his chest, a magnetic tug that made it hard to move or even breathe. Jasmine's hand tightened on his, and he noticed the tiniest tremor in her fingers, the only hint that she too felt the intensity of the moment, the pressure of the invisible forces wrapping around them. Then, as suddenly as it started, the hum ceased, and an eerie silence settled over the room, so profound that Marcus could hear the faint drip of a leaky faucet from somewhere in the distance, and even that sound seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. The teacher's smile returned, this time warmer, almost maternal, yet it carried a weight of promise and a warning all at once. "It's your choice now," she said, and Marcus's heart lurched because the words weren't meant for him alone. They seemed directed at the children, at Jasmine, at the invisible currents that pulsed in the air, and perhaps he feared at the very fabric of reality. The walls seemed to pulse gently, almost imperceptibly, and Marcus's attention was drawn to a shimmering pattern along the linoleum floor that hadn't been there before, geometric shapes forming and reforming like a living tapestry, intricate and mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. He took a tentative step backward and stumbled over nothing, as if the floor itself had shifted beneath him, playing tricks on his senses, bending perception, warping reality. Jasmine tugged at him again, pulling him toward the center of the circle the teacher had created. And Marcus realized he was not being invited into the middle, but summoned coerced, drawn by some invisible force that defied logic and reason. His stomach churned, adrenaline pumping through every vein, while a part of him, an irrational, terrified, awestruck part, was fascinated, utterly captivated by the strange, beautiful, terrifying choreography unfolding around him. He saw the children's eyes glimmer with awareness beyond their years, with knowledge and understanding that no 7 or 8-year-old should possess, and he wondered, in a cold, creeping panic, it had stumbled into something forbidden, ancient, or even dangerous, something that used innocence and curiosity as its conduit. Jasmine's gaze met his again, and in that look Marcus felt both love and inevitability, the sense that whatever had been set in motion in this room was not accidental, and that she had always known it would come, that she had always been ready, while he had not. The teacher's voice, now a whisper that somehow echoed in the deepest parts of his mind, said, "Let the witness see, let him understand if he can." And with a flick of her wrist, a subtle movement that seemed almost too delicate to carry meaning, the room changed again. The air thickened, lights dimmed further, and shadows deepened, coalescing into shapes that resembled creatures, figures, forms that seemed alive yet intangible, flickering in the periphery of Marcus's vision. The children's murmur resumed, a low, melodic hum that intertwined with the flickering shadows, forming a tapestry of sound and movement that made Marcus dizzy, his mind teetering on the edge of comprehension. And then Jasmine spoke, not loudly, but just enough that Marcus could hear, her voice steady, resonant, and shockingly confident. "Dad, you have to trust me. It's real, and it's coming for us." The words, simple but terrifying, hung in the air, and Marcus realized that in trying to protect his daughter, he had walked headfirst into a world he could neither escape nor understand, a world where rules, logic, and safety were irrelevant. The teacher's gaze swept over him one final time, almost kindly, and she gestured toward the center of the room. The shadows seemed to pulse with expectation, the children's voices rising in an intricate harmonic cadence, and Marcus knew with every fiber of his being, that stepping forward was inevitable, that resisting was impossible, and at the moment he placed one foot into the circle, his life, Jasmine's life, and everything he believed about the world would change forever. A low, resonant vibration filled the air, shaking the floor, vibrating through the walls, and Marcus felt the world tilt, the cafeteria dissolving into light and sound, and just as he lifted his foot to step forward, the teacher's whisper slithered into his mind. Witness or be lost. And in that heartbeat, in that breath, Marcus realized the impossible truth. He was standing on the threshold of a reality he could never return from, and the first step would determine everything. Marcus's foot hovered over the shimmering floor, the invisible force in the cafeteria tugging at him like a current in a dark river, his mind screaming at him to retreat even as his body betrayed him, compelled forward by something he could neither see nor resist. The children watched silently, their wide, unblinking eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten, and Jasmine squeezed his hand, whispering, "It's okay, Dad, just watch," though the tremor in her voice betrayed the tension beneath her calm exterior. The teacher stepped back, her presence radiating power and certainty, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch toward Marcus, coiling and twisting like living smoke, beckoning him into the center of the circle, with a floor now pulsed with light, geometric patterns forming and shifting with rhythm that resonated through his bones, each pulse in perfect synchronization with his heartbeat. He swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in his mouth, and tried to make sense of the impossible scene before him. The cafeteria had transformed into a luminous, surreal arena, the air thick with energy, yet there was no sense of danger, at least not in the traditional sense. Yet something primal within him screamed that this was perilous in ways he could not comprehend. Jasmine's gaze locked on his, and in that glance he understood that she had been prepared for this moment, that she had been trained in some way he had never imagined, that the daughter he thought he knew was both familiar and utterly changed, possessing a confidence, a knowledge, and a calmness that left him staggering. The teacher raised a hand, and a low, resonant hum filled the room once more, the children echoing it in perfect unison, their voices forming a vibrating, living wave of sound that Marcus could feel in his chest, his stomach, his limbs, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind. He wanted to turn, to run, to grab Jasmine and flee, but the invisible pull toward the center was irresistible, as though the very air itself had become a magnetic force field. With trembling legs, Marcus stepped forward, and the moment his foot touched the pulsating patterns, the floor seemed to respond, shifting beneath him, bright tendrils of light wrapping around his ankles, and he realized with start that the cafeteria itself was alive, aware, and interacting with his presence. The children's voices rose, forming a harmonic structure that Marcus instinctively felt in his bones, and as the hum intensified, he noticed the shadows moving independently of any light source, coalescing into forms that were vaguely humanoid yet impossible, flickering in and out of reality, circling the table, observing him. Jasmine tugged him gently, guiding him toward the center, whispering, "Dad, just follow me." And he felt a surge of trust, of fear mixed with awe that forced him to step forward again, his eyes darting between the teacher, the children, and the twisting shapes of shadow that seemed almost sentient. The teacher's voice cut through the hum, soft yet absolute. "Observe, witness, understand, and you may act." And Marcus felt the weight of those words pressed down on him, as though the air itself carried the expectation of judgment, of revelation, of something monumental that would leave no part of his life unchanged. He glanced at Jasmine, who was now standing confidently at the heart of the circle, her small hands raised slightly, fingers extended, and as she mirrored the subtle gestures of the teacher, Marcus realized she was conducting, in her own way, guiding the energy, the rhythm, the flow of whatever had overtaken the space, and a surge of pride mixed with terror hit him like a tidal wave. The shadows began to shift more dramatically, stretching, contorting, and weaving to the children in intricate patterns that Marcus could hardly follow with his rational mind. Yet Jasmine seemed to anticipate every move, every ripple, every pulse, and was both terrified and mesmerized by her command, by the almost mystical synergy between teacher, students, and the living, breathing patterns in the room. Then came a shift so sudden and profound that Marcus felt himself stumble backward. The patterns on the floor shot upward like beams of liquid light, forming columns that surrounded the circle, separating him from the rest of the room. And in that moment, the teacher's voice seemed to echo in his mind rather than his ears, soft and commanding. "You are a witness now, Marcus, not merely a father. You must see, and in seeing, you'll understand the weight of knowledge, the burden of truth." The words made him shiver uncontrollably, a chill running from his spine to his fingertips, and he realized that the ordinary life he had known, commuting, bills, mundane arguments, casual parenting, had been stripped away in an instant, replaced by something vast, ancient, and unfathomable. Marcus tried to speak, to ask what was happening, what he should do, but no sound emerged, as if the room itself had swallowed his voice, and a sudden, low vibration rattled to the floor, pulsing outward in concentric circles that lifted the children slightly from their chairs, their feet hovering, their bodies suspended in the rhythm of the energy that dominated the space. His eyes widened as he saw Jasmine rise, her body glowing faintly, outlined by an ethereal shimmer that seemed to emanate from within her, the power and focus in her posture undeniable, frightening, awe-inspiring. Marcus's heart thudded painfully. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to ground her in reality, but he couldn't. The pull was too strong, the rhythm of the room too commanding, the teacher's gaze too intense, holding him in place as if binding him in a living spell. The shadows now took form more distinctly, humanoid figures with indistinct features, flickering between material and ephemeral, circling Jasmine and the children in a silent, deliberate choreography, and Marcus realized that this was no ordinary ritual. It was a summoning, a demonstration, a revelation of powers and knowledge that the world outside could never comprehend. A sudden jolt of fear struck him when one of the figures paused and extended a shadowy limb toward him, not menacingly, but in a gesture that demanded recognition, acknowledgement, a silent invitation to participate, and Marcus froze, unsure whether to comply or resist, terrified of both options. Jasmine's gaze met his again, unwavering, imploring, and he felt compelled to step forward, crossing the threshold into the circle despite every fiber of his being screaming against it. The moment he did, a cascade of sensation flooded him. Sight, sound, emotion, memory, and understanding all at once. An overwhelming torrent that left him gasping, knees weak, mind reeling. He felt centuries of knowledge, whispers of truths buried long before his lifetime, connections between people, energy, and places he couldn't comprehend, yet somehow understood, all threading through him like a living network. his vision blurred, shadows and light coalescing into a swirling tapestry of color and motion, children's voices harmonizing into a symphony that carried not only sound but meaning, and he realized with a bone-deep shiver that Jasmine was not just participating. She was controlling, guiding, shaping the energy, and that the teacher's role was as mentor, facilitator, observer, leaving Jasmine as a conductor. Panic flared once more, but was laced with wonder. Terror intertwined with awe as Marcus felt himself being drawn into a rhythm, a flow, a current of knowledge and power that was impossible to resist. The teacher's voice, now calm, resonant, omnipresent, spoke again. See the truth, Marcus, or remain blind forever. He tried to focus, tried to hold on to a sense of self, but the world around him was dissolving, reforming, twisting in a way that defied logic, and just as he felt he might lose his grip entirely on reality, Jasmine reached out and touched his arm. The connection was instantaneous, electric, grounding yet amplifying, a tether to what he loved most yet opening him to what he had never imagined, and in that instant, Marcus knew that stepping into the circle was only the beginning. That understanding, that comprehension, that revelation would demand everything of him, and that what came next might break him, redefine him, or perhaps transform him completely. The shadows flickered violently. The columns of light pulsed faster, and the children began to move in precise, orchestrated sequence that pulled Marcus into the rhythm entirely, his heartbeat aligning with the vibration in the floor, the harmonic resonance of the voices, the shimmer of the energy around him. And then, before he could even take a breath to brace himself, the teacher whispered one final, terrifying, exhilarating word that hung in the charged air and echoed in his mind like a drumbeat of destiny. Awaken. The moment the teacher whispered awaken, Marcus felt his entire being shatter and reassemble simultaneously, a jolt of energy that tore through his mind, body, and soul, leaving him trembling yet eerily lucid, as if the world had expanded and contracted all at once, revealing layers of reality he had never glimpsed before. He could see the vibrations of the air, the living patterns in the light and shadows, the energy connecting the children, the teacher, and most shockingly, Jasmine, who stood at the center of the circle, radiating a presence so powerful it seemed to warp time itself, bending the cafeteria into something otherworldly, a nexus of knowledge, power, and ancient force. The shadows, now solidified into humanoid forms that pulsed with an inner glow, circled Marcus in silence, their movements deliberate, synchronized, almost ceremonial, and though they gave no threat, the weight of their scrutiny made him feel like he was being measured, evaluated, judged by beings beyond comprehension. Jasmine turned toward him, her expression calm yet infinitely deep, and for the first time, Marcus understood that she had been trained, prepared, and guided for this very moment, that the child he had known and raised was both familiar and unrecognizable, embodying a wisdom, a power, and a confidence that left him both awestruck and terrified. The teacher approached, her footsteps silent yet resonant, each step seeming to reverberate within Marcus's chest, and she placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder, nodding once, imperceptibly, as though granting permission for what was about to unfold. The children's hum rose in intensity, forming a harmonic resonance that seemed to weave into Marcus's very thoughts, the energy so potent that he could feel it shaping the air around him, bending the room, and forcing him to comprehend, in a fraction of a second, the immense scale of what he had stepped into, a ritual, a ceremony, a transfer of knowledge, power, and responsibility that transcended the mundane world he had lived in. Jasmine lifted her arms, and the glow around her intensified, the shadows parting respectfully, forming a circle around the perimeter, and Marcus, drawn like a moth to a flame, stepped forward, unable to resist the pull, his fatherly instincts battling with the knowledge that he was about to witness something beyond human understanding. The teacher's voice, calm, melodic, and absolute, resonated in his mind. See, Marcus, the world is not what it seems. You have been blind, limited, constrained by expectation. What you witness now is the truth beneath, the threads of life, consciousness, and power woven together, and your daughter stands the nexus. Marcus felt the ground beneath him hum, the light coiling around him, brushing his skin, filling him with warmth, clarity, and a sense of vertigo that left him gasping, unable to distinguish where he ended and the room began. The shadows began to shift, twisting into figures of abstract beauty, symbols of knowledge, entities that seemed to exist between thought and form, their presence neither threatening nor comforting, merely monumental, and Marcus realized that they were not there to harm but to demonstrate, to teach, to reveal a level of reality that no human had been allowed to witness without guidance. Jasmine's hands moved in a fluid, deliberate pattern, conducting the energy, guiding the shadows, aligning the children, shaping the vibration of the room into a coherent, almost musical flow, and Marcus could not help but marvel at her precision, her intuition, her innate connection to forces he had never imagined, all the while feeling the invisible threads linking him to her, anchoring him even as he teetered on the brink of comprehension. Then, without warning, a single shadow detached from the circle, moving directly toward him, its shape shimmering, transforming into something vaguely familiar, yet undeniably alien, and Marcus instinctively flinched, the hairs on his arms standing on end as the entity came closer, its presence carrying weight, gravity, and meaning that his rational mind could barely process. The teacher's voice, calm yet commanding, echoed once more, "Do not fear. To witness is to awaken. To awaken is to see the path ahead and to choose." Marcus felt the shadow's energy brush his consciousness, a whisper of memory, possibility, and understanding that made his mind spin, revealing glimpses of what had been, what was, and what could be, all at once, leaving him overwhelmed, exhilarated, and terrified. Jasmine reached out, her small hand glowing faintly as it connected to his, grounding him, focusing the torrent of information, and for the first time, Marcus felt a clarity he had never known. He understood not only the depth of his daughter's capabilities, but also the magnitude of responsibility, the delicate balance between power and morality, between awe and danger, between protection and freedom. The teacher stepped back, watching Marcus, her eyes calm yet piercing, as the shadows and energy flowed around him, almost coaxing him into understanding, almost demanding comprehension, and Marcus realized that the lesson was not just for children, it was for him as well. A test of trust, courage, and acceptance of the unimaginable. Suddenly, the shadows converged into a towering figure, larger than any child, larger than any adult, glowing with the combined energy of the room, and Marcus felt a pull toward it, a magnetic force that made his body lean forward, though fear and disbelief screamed to resist. The teacher's soft but insistent command echoed, "Embrace what you witness. Your fear is a barrier. Let it go." Marcus closed his eyes, inhaled sharply, and stepped fully into the center, letting the flow of energy, the harmony of voices, the pull of shadows envelop him completely, and the sensation was immediate and absolute. Knowledge, power, and understanding poured into him, a torrent that both terrified and illuminated, leaving him dizzy yet profoundly aware. He could see the hidden patterns in reality, the threads connecting life, consciousness, choices, consequences. He could feel Jasmine's mind, sharp, precise, compassionate, aligned perfectly with the rhythm of this extraordinary moment, and he knew with certainty that she was guiding him as much as he was observing her. The shadows now coalesced into a radiant canopy above the circle, symbols and forms dancing, pulsing, convey meaning without words, and Marcus realized that time itself was flexible here, layered, multidimensional, that every moment of his life, every decision, every regret, every triumph, was intertwined with his present in ways he had never imagined. He turned to the teacher, who nodded once, approvingly, almost a smile, and in that instant he understood. The event was a passage, a trial, a moment of awakening not only for Jasmine but for himself, a moment that would redefine the boundaries of fatherhood, trust, and understanding. Just as the pulse of light and energy reached a crescendo, the cafeteria shimmered, and reality began to reassemble, the shadows dissolving, the children returning to their chairs, ordinary voices whispering laughter, crumbs of lunch clattering softly onto the floor, yet Marcus's vision retained the glow, the energy, the awareness he had just experienced, leaving him changed profoundly and irrevocably. Jasmine looked up at him, smiling softly, eyes bright, and whispered, "You saw it, Dad. You understand now." Marcus knelt beside her, overwhelmed, speechless, yet a sense of pride, relief, and awe washed through him. He realized the cafeteria, the teacher, the shadows, the energy. They had not only tested him, but shown him the depth of his daughter's world, her capability, and the bond that connected them beyond ordinary understanding. As the lunch bell rang and the ordinary sounds of chatter, chairs scraping, and footsteps returned, Marcus rose, gripping Jasmine's hand, feeling the warmth of reality, and yet carrying the secret of what he had witnessed, a truth that could never be fully explained, only understood, a memory of wonder, fear, and revelation that would forever mark the moment he truly saw his daughter, not just as a child he loved, but as a powerful, extraordinary being navigating a world beyond comprehension. And in that quiet, ordinary cafeteria, Marcus finally understood the enormity of the journey ahead, knowing that nothing, not even the mundane rhythms of everyday life, would ever feel ordinary again